You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 18th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. It's 1500 in Pyongyang, 8 a.m. in Brussels, 7 a.m. here in London and midnight in Mexico City. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Globalist starts now. Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, who will take the EU's top job?
But we also need to do it with a degree of efficiency. I don't think there'll be any gratitude from Irish citizens or European citizens if politicians here in Brussels are talking for weeks on end about who's going to do what role when there are so many pressing issues at a European and global level.
Leaders met last night to thrash out the hierarchy. We'll have an analysis of the changing face of Europe. Vladimir Putin is off on his travels. We'll hear what's on the agenda in North Korea and Vietnam. Then NATO, usually coy about nuclear weapons, announces its arsenal is on standby. We'll ask what this means for global security. In Singapore, a massive clean-up operation is underway after an oil spill. We'll look at the environmental concerns for the city-state. We'll have a roundup of business news and a rustle through the front pages, plus
bureaucracy is one of Kafka's big themes. More generally, individuals faced with these rather opaque, sometimes sinister institutions, such as the court or the castle. Sometimes it's about authority.
100 years after his death, we'll look at the work of Franz Kafka as a new exhibition celebrating the playwright opens in Oxford. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the six-member war cabinet in a widely expected move following the departure from government of centrist former General Benny Gantz. Several oil storage tanks are on fire after a drone attack early today in the town of Azov in Russia's southern region of Rostov. And influential former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, a powerful backer of the ruling government, was formally indicted today. Do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, European Union leaders met last night in Brussels to start deciding who gets the top jobs. Although the choices will only be announced formally at a summit next week, a consensus already appears to be emerging. Well, I'm joined now by Suzanne Lynch, who's global playbook author and associate editor at Politico in Brussels. Suzanne, welcome back to the show. Now, Ursula von der Leyen's European People's Party, the EPP, was the biggest winner in the parliamentary elections. I wonder what that means for her bid for 5 more years at the top.
This is very good news for Ursula von der Leyen. I think that was the key metric by which she would be judged, whether she had a shot for another 5 years at the top of the Commission. And because her political group, the EPP, did the best, won the most seats in the European Parliament election, she is being given first dibs, really, at the top job in Europe, the head of the European Commission. Now, her problem is she needs to get 2 sets of people behind her. One are EU leaders. She needs a qualified majority of those. And they met last night, and where it was not really agreed, people had thought it would really be signed off. It wasn't. But secondly, she needs the approval of a majority of MEPs in the European Parliament. This could be a little bit trickier because in corners of the European Parliament, she is not that popular. And what she and her people now are looking at is whether they can build an alliance with other groups. They did that the last time around, the Renew Europe group, the Socialists in the Parliament, maybe some help from the Greens to get her over the line and get that magic number of 361 votes that she will need in the European Parliament. That vote won't happen, though, until next month, but she's pretty confident that she will get there.
Right. Now, the president of the European Council, which represents member states, is currently filled by Charles Michel. Who are the contenders to replace him?
Yeah, I think the top name that's been circulated is the former Prime Minister of Portugal, Antonio Costa. He is from that left-wing socialist political family, and so they're very much behind him, and they feel they need to get one of the other top jobs because they were the second largest party in the European elections. The problem for him is that he had to resign last year in connection with a scandal, an influence peddling scandal. Now, he has said he has done nothing wrong. He volunteered an interview himself with prosecutors, but that is looming over him. It could be an issue, but last night it seems that most leaders are pretty much behind him, although Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, did refer to this scandal, saying we need to get clarity on that one.
Yeah. What about the EU's foreign policy chief?
Yeah, so that's currently held by Josep Borrell, the Spanish commissioner. And it's a tricky one. It's the EU's top diplomat, but in a way they are kind of falling between two stools, between the Commission and the Council. And ultimately, member states have a lot of power when it comes to foreign policy. So in a way, that role is important, but they're always kind of constrained by the limits of the office. In saying that, there are some big names doing the rounds on this job, and it looks like consensus is emerging around Kaja Kallas. She's the Prime Minister of Estonia and has really developed a very high profile internationally, particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. Her issue may be, however, that some countries believe that because Estonia is just over the border from Russia and is hugely interested to a fault, if some people say, about what's happening there. In other words, they believe that Estonia and some of the Baltic countries are all they worry about is the Russia-Ukraine war, and that as a result, they're not worried about other things that are happening in the world. For example, the EU's relationship with Africa, or what's happening in Latin America, or indeed the United States. So she's had a kind of a battle behind the scenes in her officials, convincing people that she's not just an expert on Russia-Europe relations, that she is interested in other things, that she will be a foreign policy chief for all. So it looks like, again, I think that she really will have enough support. I think there are countries, most countries are getting behind her for that job.
There's also a fourth job, that of European Parliament President. Now, that's decided by the leaders. So how does that work?
Yeah, so Roberta Metsola, who took over, she looks like she is in for another. It's usually by 2.5 years, and then it can be renewed, but maybe not. But she is a shoe-in for another 2.5 years at the helm of the European Parliament. She came in. She's a member of the EPP, that group that von der Leyen is a member of it. And of course, she came in. People, it's easy to forget this now, but the previous head of the European Parliament, David Sassoli, actually died in office. Tragically. So she came in there. She was relatively unknown, but has really kind of moved into that job as head of the European Parliament. And there seems to be little resistance to her getting another 2.5 years at the top of the Parliament. She's from Malta. She's well liked, and it looks like she's a shoe-in for that job too.
Now, Italy's leader, Giorgia Meloni, did very well in the elections. How has this strengthened her hand within Europe, and how might she use that power?
Yeah, so EU leaders met, all 27 of them, last night in Brussels, and there had been expectations that there would be, at least in principle, a sign-off for these jobs. But talks went on much longer than people had anticipated, and even though we're hearing that, yes, there still is, for example, sufficient support, we believe, for Ursula von der Leyen, that Meloni in particular, the Italian Prime Minister, was not happy that some of the other countries had met beforehand and were trying to kind of agree this before the meeting proper. And the body language from Meloni was quite negative last night. And we were hearing that she wasn't quite happy with how the process was working, that she felt that there should be more of a discussion, there should have been last night, on how people like her own party, which did very well in the European Parliament elections, but other far-right parties and right-wing parties did well across Europe. And she felt that that wasn't reflected in the discussion about the top jobs. Now, in saying this, she, as I said, a lot of the names look like they're probably in the bag. It's not 100% sure, particularly Costa. So what could she be looking for? I think she's probably looking for a very senior job for Italy within the European Commission. Each country gets a commissioner, but which commission portfolio you get is very important. So she is likely to argue that her country, should get one of the more senior commission jobs. So I think that's going to be part of the discussion. She also significantly met Viktor Orban one-on-one before the summit. And what's interesting there is that in the European Parliament, where her party is one of the top political parties in the right-wing ECR group. There's discussions about maybe Orban joining that, and that could mean an expanded right-wing bloc in the European Parliament, and her party and she herself will be centrally involved with that. So we don't have any details about that. The Parliament doesn't meet until next month, but that's, I think, one of the big ways she is going to show her power over the next 5 years.
So, Suzanne, if you kind of pull back the lens and look at the big picture, how would you say the future of the EU is shaping up?
Well, currently it's looking like, not much is going to change. If we think that, as some of those figures I mentioned, get those jobs, I think what will be interesting is how powerful the right, particularly under the parties run by Maloney and Orban, if they team up in some way now in the European Parliament, that could have a real impact on legislation as it's passed, on the political priorities of the European Parliament, on what gets through and what doesn't. But at the end of the day, European Commission, if the European Commission is continued to be run by Ursula von der Leyen, which is very likely, we're going to get more of the same. However, I do think that anyway, we've seen more of a shift to the right over the last year or so, where von der Leyen has kind of listened. It's not just parties in Italy and Hungary. Her own party in Germany, for example, has led the charge against the Green Deal, the climate policy. So I think we've already seen a shift slightwards to the right in terms of environmental policy, in terms of migration. And I think that will continue over the next 5 years, that von der Leyen will continue to tack rightwards. And I think having a stronger bloc in the European Parliament for the right, for the far right, which we will see in the next few weeks if that happens or not, that could have a crucial impact too on the shape of the political future of the Parliament.
Suzanne, thank you very much indeed. That's Suzanne Lynch in Brussels there. And this is The Globalist. It is 15:12 in Pyongyang, 7:12 here in London. In March last year, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president over war crimes in Ukraine. Now, this severely limits his travel options, but there are a couple of countries which are not members of the ICC who'll be laying out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin this week. He'll travel to North Korea today and then on to Vietnam. And I'm joined now by the Russia analyst and Monocle Radio regular, Stephen Dial. Stephen, welcome back to the show. Now, North Korea has long been a friend of Russia. I wondered if you could lay out a timeline of their relationship.
It's very interesting. Good morning, Georgina. Yeah, it's actually fluctuated a bit. Russia, of course, under Putin has become ever more dictatorial. And so when Putin started as Russian president back in 2000, he did actually visit North Korea, almost renewing an old Soviet relationship because the Soviet Union had good relations as a communist country with North Korea. But then it fluctuated a bit. And while Putin was still trying to build a decent relationship with the West, Russia did actually criticize North Korea and was in favor of UN sanctions against North Korea all the way up until 2017. And it's really just after that, in 2019, Kim Jong-un visits Russia, the Far East, Vladivostok, because it's not very far to him to go on his armoured train. And then things take another twist with the start of Russia's war against Ukraine in February 22. Kim Jong-un came out pretty quickly and said that North Korea supports this war, this fair war that Russia is waging against Ukraine and the West. And from that point, relations on the surface become warmer. So, for example, in July last year, the then Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu visited North Korea. And in September, a significant event in September last year, Kim actually visited Russia, again, only in the Far East, went to the Cosmodrome, the Vostochny Cosmodrome in the Russian Far East. And clearly, talks have been going on behind the scenes a lot since then. And particularly that visit seemed to seal the deal that North Korea would sell or give, we're not quite sure which, probably sell because they need the money, artillery shells and other military equipment to Russia. It's estimated that since then probably 5 million North Korean artillery shells have gone to Russia. So on the surface, it's warmed in recent years. But I think the real significance of this visit is Putin if I may put it this way, sticking a finger up to the West to say, look, as you mentioned in your lead-in, the International Criminal Court has got a warrant out for me, but I can still travel.
Yeah. Now, as you say, that the artillery shells going to Russia, but I wonder beyond that what each country wants from the other. What does Russia need from North Korea and vice versa?
Russia clearly needs a continuing supply of ammunition for its war in Ukraine. Russian factories, despite being on a war footing, can't produce the amount they need. But also, again, an interesting development perhaps is that we expect North Korea possibly to be sending troops or people volunteering, perhaps, for, not wearing North Korean army uniforms, but volunteering to go and fight for Russia in the war in Ukraine. The other way round, North Korea is a desperate country that desperately needs food. So food, any sort of supplies that Russia can give. Sometimes you'll see reports that talk about a friendship between the two countries. This is a very misleading word to use in English. Kim and Putin are the kind of people who don't have friends. In the international sense, they have foreign leaders they might want to use. And in this case, they're the two most sanctioned countries in the world. In that sense, it all looks rather pathetic that these two countries desperately need to show the world that we're not entirely alone. But it doesn't really come off. There's no real depth to this relationship.
Yeah. Well, Vietnam is also keen to strengthen the allegiance with Russia, but this is slightly more problematic because the United States, which upgraded relations with Hanoi last year, is Vietnam's top trading partner. So how's Washington reacted to the announcement that Putin will be going to Vietnam?
Washington's not very happy about this, as you might expect from what you just said. And no doubt behind the scenes, they'll be putting a bit of pressure on Vietnam to say, don't go making big deals with this guy. It's one that's certainly of more use as a flag waving exercise to Mr. Putin than it certainly is to Vietnam. I think he's trying to show, look, I can go not just to North Korea. We've got friends and allies elsewhere. I think, although Washington won't be very happy, I don't think Washington is going to really lose any sleep over what deals might be done between Russia and Vietnam.
But I wonder what Vietnam stands to gain from annoying the US and effectively slightly damaging, perhaps, the diplomatic and economic ties that they have worked hard to build up recently.
They have. I think that they, like a number of countries, will sort of try and keep a balance between what has become once again East and West. So they'll probably take the slap on the wrist that the Americans will give them and say, well, we have to show that we're an independent country. I think that'll be a kind of tag on to the end of the visit, which, as I say, slap on the wrist. Don't think the Americans will use it to ruin relations with Vietnam. It's the first part of the visit to North Korea, which I think stands out in this visit.
So we know that the Vietnamese Deputy Foreign Minister went to a BRICS meeting in Russia earlier last week, I think. And along with most members of BRICS, both North Korea and Vietnam would like to see a new world order free from the Western liberal democracy. I wonder what Putin's travel plans and the undoubted warm welcome he'll receive in both countries mean for this growing anti-Western alignment.
I think there'll be a lot of propaganda value to it, at least back in Russia. That's what he'll use it for. He'll say, look, I can still travel the world, even though it's a pretty small world for him. He will certainly use it for that. But I think the rest of the world will be pretty dismissive. The worry is it comes back again to this question of arms and arms and ammunition from North Korea to Russia. That's the big deal. One other thing, actually, I should have added earlier that North Korea is probably getting satellite technology from Russia. After a couple of false starts, North Korea in November last year did launch its first spy satellite. Some people tried to link that to the visit in September to the Cosmodrome by Kim. It's too close to it. They won't have made significant advances then. The talks would have been going on behind the scenes. That's the sort of thing that worries the Americans far more. Not only the Americans, the Japanese as well, the South Koreans, of course, in the regional context. So that's what really sticks out from this. The rest of it is a propaganda coup for Putin.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. That's Stephen TL there. Now, still to come on the programme, a flick through the morning's newspapers, and Singapore mobilises to clear up an oil spill. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers, and joining me down the line from Paris is Agnès Poirier. She's a journalist and author of Notre Dame, the Soul of France. Agnès, welcome back to the programme. Now, we are starting with Le Parisien and a long interview given by Jordan Bardella. Tell us more.
So, you may be forgiven for not knowing who Jordan Bardella is, but I have the feeling you might have an idea, since President Macron dissolved the parliament last Sunday the 9th of June, after the European elections. So the man is 28, and he may become in 3 weeks' time France's next prime minister. There's a detail that speaks volume and is not very well known, even in France. He's married to the niece of Marine Le Pen, and that's the reason why he's the president of her party. He has no degree, has never worked other than in the family party, but he might be our next prime minister. So he gives a long interview in Le Parisien where he will announce, or where he's announcing that he will take emergency measures first, and also in the autumn start reforms. So what has he got for us? Well, he will start immediately with a law that he hopes he will be passing during the Paris Games to drop VAT on all energy prices. So that will cost about 20 billion euros. For the moment, he says he will finance it by reducing France's contribution to the EU by 2 billion euros. So, he's still looking for 18 billion. The other emergency measures he's talking about are quite predictably, about law and order. So he wants to increase prison sentences for delinquents, withdraw benefits for the parents of delinquents, revise the way one acquires French nationality, and not make it automatic for those who are born in France of foreign parents. But for that, he needs to revise the constitution, and he can't do it without the approval of the Senate and the president. So, it's not going to be an easy sell for him. But at least we have, we have an idea of what we might expect.
And in this interview, is it all just outlining policy, or do we get to learn some more personal details about him?
No, it's all about policies. I mean, there's been, in France, if you're interested in the far right, there's been one biography already. He's only 28, but about the man. And a few articles, of course, about him. But I'm sure a lot of journalists are looking deeper in his past. I mean, he often presents himself as a man of the people. Well, it is true that his mother comes from a very modest milieu, and he was brought up in the suburbs of Paris and not the plushest suburbs of Paris. But his father is a businessman from really the bourgeoisie. So it's he likes to present what is going to be useful for his career. But really, the most important thing is that he belongs to the family clan of Le Pen, because that's how it works in the party. They are all related to some degrees.
Now, there's continuing coverage of the remarks by Kylian Mbappe. Tell us more.
Yes, so a few hours before he actually broke his nose, you might know that during the match yesterday evening between France and Austria. Well, a few hours earlier, he called for the French not only to vote, but also to fight the extremes with an S, that is to say both the far right and the far left. And there's a very interesting take and interview in L'Express, the French weekly, of Jean-Baptiste Guégan, who is a sport expert. He also teaches sport and geopolitics at Sciences Po in Paris. And he says, well, that's very brave and daring of him, because, of course, it's easier just to call to bar the far right from reaching power, but to talk about both extremes that are threatening French democracy, because really in 2 weeks' time, we might, or 3 weeks' time for the second round, we might have the far left leading at the National Assembly, and therefore it won't be Jordan Bardella as our next prime minister, but possibly Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So Kylian Mbappé, who has 118 million followers on Instagram and doesn't communicate very often, his words have even more impact. And also we know that he's in charge of his own social network. So it's not his, a PR company doing it for him. In the 80s, early 90s, footballers usually were considered as celebrities, but since the late 90s, they also dive into the political arena, especially in France, and they do have an impact more than artists do. So he's a bit of Taylor Swift, if you'd like. Of course, a lot of people say, well, he's a millionaire. He's not going to suffer whether, the France is under far right or far left. But it is true, but he also he can easily leave France. He also gives a voice to people who won't be able to leave France. So he will have an impact, according to that sport expert, perhaps more importantly on the youth and the undecided and the people who usually don't go and vote.
Yes, yeah. Now, of course, we're almost forgetting about the Olympics. Fast approaching.
Yes, I had completely forgotten we were welcoming the world in a few weeks' time. Well, I was reminded of the Paris Games by Le Parisien, because yesterday I was actually up, but not by the Seine River banks. At dawn, there was a rehearsal on the Seine River on the very big stretch of 6 kilometers, and 55 boats and barges and even pedalos took part in a fast rehearsal. So it was really about synchronization, because during that parade, or that floating ballet, athletes and delegations will be traveling by boat or barges. And so they must get into cameras frame at a precise given time and a precise place. So imagine that, doing that on water. But this is really what was happening. So now there's another rehearsal if you want to wake up at dawn and be a witness to that. Next Monday, June the 24th, and this time 85 boats and barges and pedalos will take part. I think that will be an interesting thing to watch.
Absolutely. And of course, this section of the opening is the one that's worrying security chiefs most. It's the one that's going to be the most difficult to police, given that it takes place over such a large stretch of the river.
Oh, yes, completely. I mean, it's called Plan A. President Macron a few weeks ago said, don't worry, there will be a Plan B. That is to say, just at a place, probably the Place du Trocadero with the Eiffel Tower in the background. But really, the organizers said yesterday, we're only working on Plan A. But I do hope they're also working secretly on Plan B. And, interestingly enough, Jordan Bardella, perhaps our next prime minister, said, well, I leave it entirely to the state and to the interior minister to do the right thing. So he's really washing his hands of what might happen if he's prime minister during the Paris Games.
And so I wonder what the feeling about the Games is as we get closer and closer. Does Paris feel excited or kind of resigned?
Well, until that dissolution of the parliament, because really we have completely forgotten about the Paris game. So until that moment, Parisians didn't really look forward to it. I mean, everybody was planning to leave to somewhere in Normandy or in the south of France or in Brittany, and just to let the city to tourists and to and just hoping that everything would go according to plan. But it's as if we're too, we're too worried to actually be here present.
And yes, thank you very much indeed. And just a reminder to listeners that Monocle Radio and Monocle Magazine will have a large presence in Paris during the Olympics. We'll be bringing you lots of programmes from there during that time. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the six-member war cabinet, an Israeli official said on Monday, in a widely expected move following the departure from government of centrist former General Benny Gantz. The move was announced as a US special envoy visited Jerusalem, seeking to calm the situation on the disputed border with Lebanon, where Israel said tensions with the Iran-backed Hezbollah militia are bringing the region close to a wider conflict. Several oil storage tanks are on fire after a drone attack early today in the town of Azov in Russia's southern region of Rostov, according to officials. Kyiv has often said that targeting Russia's energy, military and transport infrastructure undermines Moscow's war effort. And influential former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, a powerful backer of the ruling government, was formally indicted today for allegedly insulting the monarchy in a 2015 media interview. It's the first of 4 high-profile cases involving key political players that are before the courts today, in the latest legal wrangling that could see Southeast Asia's second-largest economy plunged into a new period of uncertainty. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, says the growing threat from Russia and China means the alliance is in talks to deploy more nuclear weapons, taking them out of storage and placing them on standby. This comes as the latest report by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons is released, showing that the world's 9 nuclear-armed states spent $10.7 billion more on their arsenals in 2023 than they did the year before. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Dr. Marianne Messmer, who is a Senior Research Fellow in International Security at Chatham House. Many thanks for coming in, Marianne. NATO's usually very reticent when it comes to talking about nuclear weapons. Why has Stoltenberg felt moved to make this public?
I thought that was such an interesting question. And when I first saw his comments, I was wondering what they were about, because, as you say, it seemed like such an about face. And when I then looked into his remarks and the clarifications that NATO issued after, it seemed like he was primarily talking about the ongoing modernization efforts that the US had undertaken and that therefore also apply to the NATO member states that are part of extended deterrence. So in other words, this might be much more about NATO trying to be transparent about the modernizations that are ongoing, rather than actually announcing any immediate shifts in its deterrence posture. It also comes at the same time as the US has said, again, quite publicly a few times, that if developments in Russia and China continue on as they are at the moment, with the Chinese nuclear arsenal expanding and Russia also modernizing, that the US might indeed need to take some of its warheads that are currently in storage out of storage. But as far as I could tell, no changes have been made and no decisions have been made that any any new deployments are going to be made immediately.
I mean, because the US has been talking, or people have been talking about US deployment within Europe. Are there nuclear bombs in locations within Europe that belong to the US already?
There are. So there are, under what's called NATO nuclear sharing, there are US nuclear weapons in a few different European countries. Officially, we don't know which countries those are, but in practice, we do know that it is Turkey, Germany, the Netherlands, and Belgium. I might be forgetting some here, Italy as well. So we do know where those bombs are located, in part because they are, if they were to be used, they would be used via certain US aircraft. So the recent discussions about which countries would acquire F-35 have essentially been a part of that modernization program. And that's a bit of a giveaway of which NATO member states are part of the nuclear sharing agreement.
Is it a worry that Turkey's on that list?
This has been discussed on and off, and there actually are debates whether Turkey still has nuclear weapons stored on its territory, because around the time when there was a coup a few years ago, there were some rumors that the US might have removed its nuclear weapons. So one of the tricky things with secrecy surrounding nuclear weapons is that we can never be quite sure where exactly they are or aren't. But officially, Turkey is still acquiring F-35s, which means that there's a good chance that they do have nuclear weapons. Right. And they have actually been a reliable NATO ally during, the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
So nuclear armed states include Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, India, China, France, the UK, Russia and the US. And I wonder what the level of threat from those various countries is. I mean, who's openly threatening to use them? How much of it's rhetoric? Are there some states that we should find genuinely alarming? And who is NATO arming against?
So traditionally, NATO is a defensive alliance about the threat from the Soviet Union and now Russia. So NATO has been extremely concerned with some of the nuclear threats that the Russian government has made throughout the invasion of Ukraine. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were also extremely worried about North Korea, perhaps less as a threat for Europe, but definitely as a threat for various Asian countries and for the United States, because North Korea is also very prone to heavy nuclear rhetoric, much more so than we would find comfortable, probably. And India and Pakistan have threatened each other quite a lot with nuclear weapons, so perhaps less of a threat for the rest of the world, though, of course, if there's a nuclear escalation in any part of the world, it's very possible that that would concern all of us.
Yeah. So ICAN is the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. They say that those 9 nuclear-armed nations allocated a total of $91 billion to nuclear capabilities in the last year alone. And that, of course, highlights the significant rise in spending. And I wonder who's responsible for the bulk of spending and what are they spending it on? Is it new weapons, more weapons, or increasing infrastructure and so on?
So the bulk of the spending would have come from the US, Russia and China. China has been expanding its nuclear arsenal for the last few years. Its stated reason is that it wants to be on par with the US and Russia, in part because of the increased threat that it perceives from the United States in the Asia Pacific. The US has been in a long-standing modernization program because a few of its nuclear weapons essentially need routine maintenance. Some of these weapons have been around since the 50s and 60s, so you can imagine that there's a lot of maintenance that needs to be done. And it is also investing in new submarines, which are very costly. Russia has also been modernizing its nuclear program. It's about the same age as that of the United States, so there is some sort of routine investment that needs to be done. And Russia has also invested in some new capabilities which it felt that it needed in order to match or deter the United States in some ways. Some of these weapons are quite experimental, and it's not clear whether they will ever be operational, but the development still requires a lot of funds, whereas some of them, like the non-nuclear version of them, we have seen used in Ukraine, for example, when it comes to certain hypersonic capable glide vehicles and so on.
So the director of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, says, "We are now in one of the most dangerous periods in human history." I mean, is this just down to nuclear weapons? And would you agree with him?
I would agree. This is in huge part down to nuclear weapons, but I think it's also because we are in a much more multipolar environment. So we have more nuclear armed states than we did during the Cold War, and we have much more different conflicts going on. So it's not just about Russia and the United States. There's also the question of China and how China relates to those power dynamics. I already mentioned the tensions between India and Pakistan. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of us would have probably said that India and Pakistan is the most potentially explosive nuclear dynamic that we've got globally. And now everyone's kind of forgotten about it just because there are other more pressing issues. We've got, of course, Israel in the Middle East as a nuclear armed power, and Iran potentially building up a nuclear weapon. That could be another really dangerous dynamic. So we've got lots of conflict dynamics that are already creating huge human cost and creating huge suffering. And if you add nuclear weapons and the potential for escalation to that dynamic, then it creates a pretty scary picture.
Marion, thank you very much indeed. That's Dr. Marion Messmer, and you're with Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's 14:41 in Singapore, 8:41 in Zurich. Now, Singapore is a major maritime hub. Hundreds of ships and fuel bunkers are found around the city-state's southern coastline. And on Friday, one of those ships, a Netherlands-flagged dredging boat, crashed into a moored Singaporean fuel vessel, causing a spill of about 400 tons of oil. Now, much of this washed onto the shore, and now the authorities are scrambling to clean it up. Well, Naomi Zhu Elegant is Monocle's writer based in Singapore, but she's actually in London at the moment. She joins me in the studio to discuss. Welcome, Naomi. How significant, then, is this spill?
So in terms of actual tonnage, it's not that big. 400 tons, obviously no amount of oil spillage is good. But for context, Singapore's largest spill in about 25 years ago was 23,000 tons. But the difference with this one is that it was really close to the shoreline, and the oil has now spilled onto the beach of Sentosa Island, which is a really popular tourist destination. And because of that, rather than 11 nautical miles out to sea where humans wouldn't be impacted as much and, shoreline wildlife, it's really a lot more visible and a lot more environmentally damaging to the shore.
So tell us then about the scale of the cleanup that's going on.
So I think there's about 200 workers who are in full hazmat, cleaning up the oil as fast as they can. And Singapore government has also employed about 1,500 volunteers. There may be more now because people are really dedicated to it, to kind of help patrol the area. There's a lot of mangroves on the shoreline. There's marine parks. There's a lot of beaches. And if anybody sees, even a little oil sheen or slick anywhere, they're encouraged to call the government so that they can make sure it's dealt with. And there's also a 1 mile of containment booms, which are basically floating barriers that trap the oil so that it can then be scooped up.
And what about wildlife?
Right now, it seems to be okay. I think a lot of fish are probably going to be endangered or killed, but it's harder to measure that in the few days since it's happened. There has been one viral photo of a little kingfisher, which is a very cute, colorful bird that bird watchers are especially fond of, covered in oil, which was going viral online. But luckily, the animal rescue team has actually managed to rescue him. He's alive. They've cleaned his feathers. He's making a slow recovery.
And what are the larger environmental risks to Singapore?
I mean, right now, again, because the response was so fast, it seems like it's going to be okay. I think environmental groups like Greenpeace have already said there's never going to be an oil spill that is entirely cleaned up because of the nature of oil. You know, it will disperse and dissolve so quickly. The dispersant is one of the chemicals that is often used in cleaning up oil spills that basically dissolves it into smaller particles so that it's easier to clean in the water. But, you know, those small particles are going everywhere, right? There's coral systems to think about. There's always fresh air and fresh water that's going to be damaged. So I think whenever we're thinking about fossil fuels, there's always a question of, you know, any spill is going to have damage that we can't control, basically.
Naomi, thank you very much indeed. That was Monocle's Naomi Zhu Elegant, and this is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Well, it's time now to talk business with Isabel Hamilton, who joins us down the line. Isabel, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Some news from Apple.
Yes, Apple is shutting down its buy now, pay later service. So there was a time when Apple was quite keen to get into financial services. You know, it launched a credit card with Goldman Sachs, and it had this buy now, pay later service that it presented as something that it was furnishing itself. You know, it wasn't partnering with any other financial companies to do it. But now it seems to be quietly retreating from that strategy. And on top of that, buy now, pay later services are under quite a bit of scrutiny from regulators. So it looks like Apple is maybe sort of moving away from the financial sector a bit.
Right. So, I mean, that had only been up for, less than a year? Or just over a year?
Yes, absolutely. It really hasn't had a very long shelf life at all.
Extraordinary. All right, well, let's move on to China, which has opened an anti-dumping probe into EU pork.
Yes, so this has some backstory. The EU last week slapped tariffs on China-made electric vehicles. The argument is that China's government is supplying electric vehicle makers with so many subsidies that it means cheap electric vehicles are going to flood the European market and kill off European competition. So this Chinese investigation into EU pork is a retaliation. China consumes a huge amount of pork. I think it consumes about half the world's pork, and about half of that is imported from the EU. So this is really just to kind of spook the EU.
Right, and when does this begin?
It's beginning pretty much immediately, but it's an investigation that could take up to a year. So Spain, which I think is the largest exporter to China of pork, is saying that it's okay, we've got time to deal with this, we've got time to ask the EU for help. But it is clearly, you know, a sort of symbolic move.
European pork producers are apparently saying that they can carry on exporting to China tariff-free, but perhaps that's only whilst the investigation's underway.
Yes, for now they can, yeah.
Yeah, right. And let's have a look at Shein or Shine. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that, but it's this huge business, but their business model is all about shipping incredibly cheap clothes.
Yes, so Shein, they ship clothes from China typically via air freight, and these clothes go everywhere. It's got footholds in the EU, in the US, in the UK. It's become absolutely massive since sort of the dawn of the pandemic. But now they seem to be sort of rejigging things a bit. They're getting ready to go public in London, actually. And it looks like, according to a Financial Times report, they're trying to put down some roots. They're trying to set up warehouses, for example. This is more traditional. And it's perhaps a little bit of a breath of fresh air for the air freight business, which really actually has been massively strained by Shein and its competitor Temu, because they're shipping like these individual packages all over the world from China. It's a huge operation.
So how are they going to change that business model? They'll have more infrastructure within Europe.
Yes, they'll have logistics infrastructure, not just in Europe, but the US as well. They're also going to start selling more than just clothes, it looks like. They're going to start selling furniture and accessories, which looks like a move that's designed to keep pace with Temu, their competitor.
I'm stunned by the stats in this FT piece about how many people actually use Shein.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of people have turned to them. The revenue is, I think, the profits are about $2 billion in 2023, which is absolutely huge. That's really drawing level with major retailers like Zara, for example.
So this piece says just over 25% of Gen Z consumers in the US and the UK have reported using the Shein app over the past month.
Yeah, it's certainly seen as a Generation Z thing. But actually, there was a report a little while back that said boomers are really into these apps as well, in the US at least. So I think, the stats you get slightly different stats sometimes, but it would be a mistake to assume we know exactly who's using it and how all the time.
But I mean, despite that huge number, actually that's a fall from peaks of, I think, 28%.
Yes, I think the worry now for Shein is that they've sort of hit a saturation point. And, they're seen as the poster child of fast fashion. They're seen as being unsustainable, not particularly ethical. And that's something that certainly younger generations really care about. They're turning more to second-hand fashion and things like this.
And in terms of a big company like this, which is manufacturing in China, can we be sure in any way that you were talking about ethics, that this is made in a way that we would not find morally repellent?
We absolutely can't guarantee that. There's been a few reports about uses of forced labour, for example, in their cotton supply chain, cotton coming from Xinjiang, where there is huge oppression of the Uyghur community there and forced labour. And the US has been quite vocal about this. There are political reasons for that as well. The US has got a bit of a trade war with China going on, but they're not wrong to say that this is a concern.
Oh, absolutely. Isabel, thank you very much indeed for joining us. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio. This month marks the centenary of the death of the writer Franz Kafka, whose works such as The Metamorphosis continue to capture the complexities of modern life 100 years on. He's the subject of a new exhibition at the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford, which has brought together original documents from his life and work, some for the very first time. Monocle reporter George Ruskin went to Oxford for a tour from its curator, Professor Carolyn Duttlinger. He began by asking for her definition of the often misunderstood term Kafkaesque.
Bureaucracy is one of Kafka's big themes. More generally, individuals faced with these rather opaque, sometimes sinister institutions, such as the court or the castle. Sometimes it's about authority. But for me, actually, the Kafkaesque is probably less about themes. It's more about a particular mood, about the way that Kafka writes, and this sense of ambiguity and uncertainty.
He also wrote a vast amount of letters. These give us a real sense of his personality, don't they? Especially his sense of humour. And humour is something that's often overlooked in his works, isn't it?
I think so, yeah. I think you actually have to read them out loud to really appreciate the dark humour there. So, for instance, try reading out loud the beginning of The Metamorphosis, and it's actually very, very absurd and funny how Gregor Samsa tries to just get on with his day, even though he's now a giant bug. Just this excruciating passage about him trying to get out of bed. I've missed my train. Oh, well, I'll catch the 7 o'clock one. I can still make up for lost time. And, it's just incredibly funny. Kafka famously laughed out loud when he was reading the first chapter to his friends. So we really have to factor that in, I think, when we read Kafka's texts, that he is actually a great satirist as well. And then another exhibit I really like is this one here, which is one of Kafka's diaries. And what's striking there is that you've got a sentence which is crossed out several times to the point where you can basically not read it anymore. So this is a diary from 1911. Kafka has barely published or written anything, just a few stories. And yet he says in this diary, without a doubt, I am now the intellectual centre of Prague. And then he crosses it out because he's obviously slightly ashamed of his own arrogance. But nonetheless, he writes that sentence. And I think it gives you a sense of how confident Kafka was actually in his ability as a writer.
Do you think some of that's lost in translation into English? Because at the start of the Metamorphosis, for example, he doesn't turn into a cockroach or, I don't know, a spider. He turns into an Ungeziefer, doesn't he? Which is kind of an unspecified insect. And then that's kind of given rise to a multitude of different translations. So what are the challenges in translating Kafka, do you think?
Yeah, no. So as you say, the term Ungeziefer at the beginning of the Metamorphosis is famously tricky to translate, and I would say none of the existing translations completely capture the meaning. But of course, between them, they do a really good job. So it's partially about specific words, and then it's partially also about rendering Kafka's style, and especially the rhythm of his prose. So Kafka likes to very consciously use punctuation to kind of create different speeds for his writing. So sometimes he writes really, really long sentences, stringing together lots of main clauses with commas. And then that's suddenly punctuated by a really short, punchy sentence. And so here we've got the opening page of the Metamorphosis. So you can once again see this very clear handwriting, actually. He makes a few changes, but not many, probably about 4 or 5 on that first page. But the opening sentence, the opening paragraph really sort of just emerges, fully formed. Als Gregor Samsa eines Morgens aus unruhigen Träumen erwachte, fand sich in seinem Bett zu einem ungeheuren Ungeziefer verwandelt. And ungeheuer can mean giant, but it can also mean monstrous. So it's another one of those words that's really hard to translate. Whichever word you choose, you're missing something of it. You can see also he's starting a new notebook here. So this was obviously a big moment.
And let's just stick with the Metamorphosis for another moment, because it's a big focus of the exhibition here at the Bodleian. Why is this novella so influential in his canon?
I think because it is perhaps the most iconic and accessible of his works. And of course it resonates with a lot of literary tradition that we know. So the idea of a human being turning into an animal we know from mythology. But what's really interesting is how Kafka uses that motif, namely not in a kind of fantasy, surreal sort of mode, but he kind of transplants this into a realist story about family life. So in a sense, the supernatural thing happens before the story even starts. And then everything else that unfolds is sort of quite deadpan. And so it's just this thought experiment, and he just rolls with it. And a look at Kafka's notebooks shows us that he never plans his stories. I think he basically just plunges into a new work and sees where it takes him. And I think that's why his works are so absorbing. It's just this sort of organically unfolding thing. So it's about expanding our definition of consciousness. Another area where Kafka is really resonant is disability studies. So if you think about the Metamorphosis, it's about coming to terms with a body which cannot be controlled. And Kafka has a lot of emphasis on the body being both something you can sort of almost fashion into whatever you want it to be. So there's a lot of stuff about clothing, about sort of performance, the performance of identity. But there's also an emphasis on the body being quite sort of obstructive and maybe uncontrollable.
And that was Professor Carolyn Duttlinger speaking to Monocle's George Ruskin in Oxford. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Vincent McAviney, Carlotta Rebello and Paige Reynolds, our researcher George Ruskin and our studio manager Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way, and the briefing is live at midday in London. The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. And just before we go, I wanted to remind you of the Swiss Summer Market here at Menorca two-storey house in London, in Marylebone, in the centre of London, in partnership with Switzerland Tourism. So do join us this Saturday in our leafy courtyard. You'll find the latest seasonal collections from the Monocle shop and also from Trunk. Plus, there'll be special guest Swiss retailers, regions and delicacies. Join us for aperitifs, cakes, coffees, whatever you like. It'll all be here. And there's going to be a mini farm, complete with friendly black-nosed sheep. I can't wait to meet you, so do come down on Saturday if you're in the area. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.